What made an ordinary factory worker become one of the most infamous serial killers in history?
I had these obsessive desires, thoughts wanting to control them.
And that's why you killed them?
Right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Almost 2 years before this interview, inside a small Milwaukee apartment, police uncovered one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history, committed by Jeffrey Dahmer. But this is not just a story of murder. It's a story of obsession, control, and a mind unlike any other. How did a seemingly unremarkable worker at a chocolate factory become the monster of Milwaukee? How did he get away with seducing, killing, and dismembering 17 young men, even consuming parts of their bodies, right under everyone's noses? But what truly sets him apart is that, unlike many serial killers, he didn't come from a background of physical or sexual abuse, yet he still became one of America's most infamous murderers. So what led him down such a dark path? We'll get into that later. Before we continue, a warning. This video contains graphic and disturbing content that may not be suitable for all viewers. If you're sensitive to discussions of violence, murder, or unsettling details, we strongly advise you to skip this video. However, if you're ready to uncover the chilling truth behind one of history's most infamous serial killers, keep watching. Viewer discretion is advised. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outside, his early life seemed unremarkable. A stable, middle-class family, a quiet suburban home. Yet beneath the surface, a foundation was being laid for something profoundly disturbing. His mother, Joyce, was frequently unwell, suffering from depression and anxiety. She regularly took prescription drugs, including antidepressants and tranquilizers, even during pregnancy. Some experts later wondered if this could have affected Jeffrey's mental development. His father, Lionel, was a scientist. Logical, methodical, but emotionally distant. He buried himself in his work, leaving Jeffrey adrift in a household filled with tension, but devoid of warmth. His mother's struggles, the endless fights, the chaos of their home, he was seen but never truly cared for. In 1966, the Dahmers relocated to Ohio, where Lionel had secured a position as a research chemist. That same year, Jeffrey's younger brother David was born, a moment that should have brought joy, but instead deepened his sense of isolation. His mother's focus shifted entirely to the new baby, while his father remained preoccupied with work. Jeffrey, once the center of attention, was now an afterthought. And then, the surgery. At age 6, Dahmer underwent a double hernia surgery. He later admitted he was terrified that his genitalia had been removed, a fear some psychologists believe sparked his obsession with body parts and dismemberment. After the surgery, something changed. The once lively, talkative boy grew quiet, distant, empty. His father, Lionel, speculated that the trauma from the surgery might have warped his perception of the human body. Could a single childhood surgery plant the first seed of Dahmer's obsession with the human body? By the age of 8, an unusual interest had taken root. While other children played sports or collected baseball cards, Jeffrey collected bones. At first, it seemed harmless. He found small animal skeletons and studied them, fascinated by their structure. But over time, curiosity turned into obsession. He began actively seeking out dead animals, roadkill, birds, rodents. He took them into the woods behind his house, dissecting them, preserving the bones, experimenting with decay. One day, his father discovered a bucket of bleached bones. Thinking it was nothing more than scientific curiosity, he encouraged his son's interest. He even showed Jeffrey how to properly clean and preserve the remains. He had no idea what he was enabling, and so the first step into something far darker had been taken. At school, he was a ghost, a shadow in the hallways, present but unseen. Desperate for attention, he became the class clown, pulling pranks, making jokes, anything to be noticed. But no matter how many laughs he got, inside he was utterly alone. And so he turned to alcohol. He drank constantly, sneaking bottles into school, downing liquor between classes. Teachers found him passed out at his desk, reeking of whiskey. When asked why he drank so much, his answer was chillingly simple. "This is my medicine." But alcohol wasn't the only thing consuming his mind. By 14 years old, his fascination with bones had evolved. Now he was fantasizing. One day, he read a newspaper article about a young man killed in a motorcycle accident. For most people, the story would be tragic, but for Jeffrey, it was something else entirely. He didn't feel sadness, he felt obsession. He studied the photograph, imagined the coldness of the body, the stillness, the lifeless beauty, and then the fantasy started. He pictured himself standing over a corpse, running his hands over the cold skin, possessing it, owning it. And soon, imagining wasn't enough. One afternoon, he hid in the bushes near a jogging trail, gripping a baseball bat in his hands. He had picked his victim. He knew what he wanted to do. He waited and waited, his hands sweating, his heart racing. But the jogger never came. That day, Dahmer went home empty-handed, but urges like his don't just fade, they wait, they build, they demand release, until finally, one night, the opportunity presented itself. The first murder, June 18, 1978. The Dahmer house in Bath, Ohio, sat empty. His mother had taken his younger brother and left town. His father, drowning in the wreckage of his failed marriage, was living in a motel. And Jeffrey Dahmer, 18 years old and completely alone for the first time in his life, was left to his own devices. It was a humid evening. Restless, directionless, and already drinking heavily, Dahmer got into his car and started driving. He had no destination in mind, just the open road, the bottle in his hand, and the static hum of thoughts that had been building inside him for years. Then he saw him. Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, a hitchhiker, shirtless, lean, carefree, everything Jeffrey wasn't. Hicks was walking along the side of the road, thumb out, looking for a ride to a rock concert. Jeffrey slowed the car and pulled up beside him. "Where are you headed?" "Cuyahoga Falls," Hicks said, grinning. He offered Hicks a ride, suggesting they stop by his house for drinks before heading to the concert. Hicks, unsuspecting, agreed. They drove off, heading toward the quiet house where no one would hear what happened next. At the house, the two drank beer, listened to music, and talked. Hicks was comfortable, unaware that Dahmer was studying him, analyzing the moment, anticipating the inevitable departure. For Jeffrey, the thought of Hicks leaving was unbearable, not just because he was alone, but because he had no control over it. His entire life had been shaped by neglect, instability, and abandonment. And in that moment, his subconscious solution to these fears was terrifyingly simple. If he couldn't make people stay, he would take away their ability to leave. As the hours passed, Hicks finally stood up, ready to leave. Dahmer panicked. He didn't want him to go. In a moment of impulsivity, fueled by years of isolation, he acted. Reaching for a nearby dumbbell, he struck Hicks. Then, to ensure he wouldn't be abandoned, he strangled him. The room fell silent, and for the first time, Dahmer felt a sense of calm. This act wasn't premeditated, yet it also wasn't without meaning. Psychologists would later analyze this moment as a critical turning point in Dahmer's psyche. He did not kill out of hatred or anger. His motive wasn't to inflict suffering, but rather to preserve a connection in the only way he believed possible. The need for control outweighed the moral consequences. Years of emotional neglect had left him feeling powerless, and in this moment, he had complete dominance over another person. He felt relief, not remorse. For many killers, the first murder brings an overwhelming sense of regret or fear, but Dahmer's reaction was different. It wasn't guilt that consumed him, but a need to maintain the moment. But now there was a new problem. What happens after a crime of impulse? For hours, Dahmer sat with the reality of what he had done, and when morning came, he made a decision that defined the years to follow. He needed to erase the evidence, not out of fear of being caught, but out of necessity. For the next 9 years, he managed to suppress his urges, or so it seemed. By 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer could no longer suppress his compulsions. The years of isolation, the fantasies, the need for absolute control, it was all reaching a breaking point. That night, in a Milwaukee hotel room after a blackout from heavy drinking, he woke up to find a lifeless body beside him. The man's ribs were crushed, his hands were bruised, he had killed but had no memory of doing it, and instead of stopping, he adapted. The realization was intoxicating. Murder wasn't the goal, it was just the means. What he truly wanted was a body that would never leave him, never resist. He lured victims from bars, selecting those least likely to be missed. He drugged them, ensuring submission without a struggle. He photographed them, preserving the moment of ultimate control. He kept their remains, turning his apartment into a shrine of possession. But this wasn't enough, because control by definition means keeping something alive. He needed to push further. He began drilling holes into his victims' skulls, injecting boiling water or acid into their brains, believing he could erase their autonomy while keeping them alive, a human puppet, an extension of himself. But every attempt failed. The bodies shut down, the life left their eyes, and Dahmer was alone again. So he tried again, and again, because in his mind this wasn't destruction, it was creation. By 1990, he was fully detached from reality. He played The Exorcist III on repeat, fascinated by the film's hypnotic villain. He wore yellow contact lenses to resemble its demonic antagonist, and in his darkest moment, he began eating them, to make them a part of him forever. But soon he would make a fatal mistake. July 22nd, 1991. A man stumbled through the streets of Milwaukee, half-naked, disoriented, wrists still bound in handcuffs. His breath was ragged, his body weak from whatever had been forced into his system. But he ran, because behind him, inside that apartment, was something worse than death. When police arrived, he led them to apartment 213. Inside, the police found a refrigerator filled with severed heads, jars of preserved organs lined up like grotesque trophies, a collection of skulls, carefully arranged, and the photographs, the meticulously documented stages of his crimes. Dahmer didn't attempt to flee, no struggle, just a quiet admission. For what I did, I should be dead. But what was even more terrifying is that it could have ended 2 months earlier, May 27th, 1991. A chilling encounter unfolded on a quiet Milwaukee street. A 14-year-old boy, naked, bleeding, and drugged, stumbled out of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Disoriented, barely able to speak, he collapsed onto the pavement. Neighbors saw him and immediately called 911. The boy had somehow managed to escape the apartment where Dahmer had planned to turn him into a living experiment. When officers arrived, Dahmer was already outside, appearing calm and composed, a master of deception. "This is just a misunderstanding," and he told them. He explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, that he had simply had too much to drink, and that they had gotten into a minor dispute. The officers hesitated. The boy was incoherent, unable to explain what had happened. The apartment was neat, nothing immediately suspicious. Despite protests from the neighbors, who insisted something was wrong, the officers handed the boy back to Dahmer. They even joked about the situation on their radios as they left. Minutes after the police drove away, Dahmer killed the boy, and just feet away, inside that very apartment, were the remains of his previous victim. The police had been inches from stopping him, but they didn't, and because of that mistake, 5 more men would die before they finally caught him. Dahmer was found sane and guilty of 15 murders, receiving 15 life sentences, a total of over 900 years behind bars. Locked away, he spent his days reading the Bible, speaking with journalists, and reflecting on his crimes. But when asked if he would ever kill again, his answer was chilling. "If I were released, I would kill again." He wouldn't get the chance. On November 28, 1994, inside the prison showers, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver took justice into his own hands, beating Dahmer to death. After years of terrorizing others, his life ended the same way he had taken so many, suddenly, violently, and without mercy. But death doesn't erase the questions he left behind. After studying the psychology of serial killers for 3 years, I've come to realize that murder is never just about the act itself. It's about the mind behind it. These killers don't just wake up one day and decide to kill. Their crimes are shaped by deep psychological patterns, twisted motivations, and unresolved trauma. So let's analyze Jeffrey Dahmer's psychological profile, not just from a crime perspective, but through the lens of psychology and human behavior. Unlike most serial killers, Dahmer wasn't driven by rage or sadism. His crimes weren't about pain, but possession. Not about hatred, but control. To understand how he became one of the most infamous murderers in history, we need to go deeper, into the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer. Unlike many serial killers who suffered physical or sexual abuse, Dahmer's trauma came from emotional neglect. His father was often absent, focused on his PhD, and his mother was struggling with mental health issues and addiction to tranquilizers. His parents fought constantly, creating an environment of instability and emotional deprivation. Was murder his way of coping with isolation, ensuring someone would never leave him again? Dahmer's fascination with motionless bodies started in adolescence. He fantasized about unconscious or dead partners, completely submissive, completely his. Dahmer did not fit the typical psychopathic profile. He showed remorse after being caught. He lacked charm and manipulation seen in serial killers like Ted Bundy. He didn't kill for sadistic pleasure. He wanted companionship, not suffering. Many psychologists believe Dahmer exhibited traits of borderline personality disorder, BPD, rather than full psychopathy. His deep fear of abandonment, impulsivity, and unstable identity align with BPD characteristics. His actions weren't just about killing, they were about preventing loss. Could he have been stopped? The warning signs were there. His obsession with dead animals as a child, his withdrawal into alcohol to numb his emotions, his first near attack at 16 when he hid in the bushes with a bat, waiting for a jogger who never came. What if someone had intervened? What if his emotional detachment had been addressed early? Would he have still become the Jeffrey Dahmer the world would come to know? Or was the darkness inside him always waiting to emerge? If you watch Jeffrey Dahmer's prison interviews, you'll notice something unsettling. He speaks calmly. He chooses his words carefully. There's no theatrics, no outbursts. He presents himself as rational, even remorseful. But the reason Jeffrey Dahmer was able to walk away freely after committing his crimes is that he was intelligent and articulate. He had spent years perfecting the mask of normalcy, but if you listen closely to his words, you'll realize it's just a thin veil. For 3 years, I have studied the psychology of serial killers. I don't tell these stories to entertain you with gore and horror. I tell them so that we may learn from them, to recognize warning signs, to be kinder to those around us, to listen to our children and classmates. If Jeffrey's parents had been more attentive, if his classmates had been kinder, maybe none of this would have happened. But it did. Let's not repeat the same mistakes. If you or someone you know struggles with mental health, seek help. Tomorrow can be better than today. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Remember, true horror is in the things we fail to see.